All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, thank you everybody for joining. This is the LAN Smart Building Applications webinar. We're going to talk to you today about the specific application of passive optical LAN and smart buildings. And often the question comes up, what is a smart building? So we're going to start today's session with a guest speaker from TIA to introduce you to the concept of a smart building and better define that for us, because I feel like that's one of those questions that if you ask 100 people, you could get 100 different answers on. So today's format will be a little bit different, and that we'll start with our speaker, and then we'll move on to a panel where we'll discuss further. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to everybody on our panel here. My name is Matt Miller. I'll serve as your moderator for today's webinar. On our panel, we'll have Chris Ennis, Blaine Overstreet, Mari Wood, and Pat Sweeney is our special guest from TIA that's going to talk to us a little bit about smart buildings and what those are. So a little bit more about each of us. Again, my name is Matt Miller. I'm with AECOM. I'm an integrator. So I'm the one that helps make all this stuff come together, make it work. I've been working in this industry for about 20 years, and specifically with passive optical LAN since about 2006. And I serve on the technology committee for the Association of Passive Optical LAN. Pat, you want to take a moment and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. Yes, my name is Pat Sweeney. I'm currently the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at TIA. So I really run everything around our membership and ensuring our members are getting the value out of their membership, developing marketing programs to grow our standards committees, technology programs. I've been in the industry for about 20 years with, before that M2M and IoT. So I've always found the smart buildings program since I joined TIA a couple of years ago is kind of one of the most, my most comfort zones.
All right, thanks, Pat. And Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Chris Ennis with Nokia. We are a PON equipment manufacturer. And so I've been in the industry for a couple decades now, focused on both copper and fiber access networks. Right now, my role is to support our ecosystem partners and really just drive the awareness and adoption of passive optical LAN. And I also sit on the technical committee at LAN.
All right, thanks, Chris. And Blaine Overstreet.
Blaine Overstreet. I am a senior solutions consultant with AECOM. Been working with IT infrastructure, almost 30 years of IT integration for large and government and enterprise customers. Was the lead engineer on one of the first POL deployments ever many years ago. Since then, thousands of ONTs deployed in various verticals. Formerly was a product line manager working with Chris at Nokia. Recently, working as an integrator at AECOM, as I said. I'm a founding former director and chairman of LAN, and I currently sit on the technology committee.
Very good. Thanks, Blaine. And Mari, I'm actually going to put you on the spot because that picture is awesome. Can you tell us about yourself and also where that picture was taken?
Sure, I'll get to that at the end, I guess. Mari Wood, I'm product line manager for field spectral and dispersion products at Exfo. Exfo is one of the big fiber test equipment companies. I've been there for a couple of years. Prior to that, I was at AFL, another test and in this case, inspection for fiber company. And prior to that, I worked at several semiconductor companies in the communications area and attended the University of Michigan. And that picture is from the summit of the Grand Teton, actually, in Wyoming.
Oh, very good. All right, great. So we have you for advice on passive optical LAN and climbing, it sounds like. All right. So let's get into that definition of what is a smart building. Because like I said, if you ask 100 people, you get 100 different answers. Hopefully, Pat can maybe better define that for us and maybe even help us figure out how we can get that documented in some way. So off to you, Pat.
All right, so I get to get the final answer on what smart buildings is.
Well, you're not the last speaker, so we might have to rebut at some point.
All right. If just first of all, thank you, Matt, for having me on today, and the LAN Association for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I really appreciate it. You can go to the next slide. I'm just going to do a quick overview of TIA, in case everybody doesn't know who we are. Yeah, so as the Trusted Industry Association for the Connected World, TIA brings together over 400 members and manufacturers, solution providers, service providers, engineering companies, et cetera, to really work together to help tackle issues for and advance the telecommunications space. We really have four intersecting communities. Standards development, we've been doing that for well over 80 years, developing, evolving standards for critical aspects of the ICT industry. So cabling and infrastructure is a big one, towers and antennas, public safety networks, and so on and so forth. So, ANSI accredited standards development organization. Government affairs and policy, driving policy initiatives, advocating both with and for our members and the industry from, all topical items. So, right now you think of things like the infrastructure spending and investment bill, supply chain issues, everything from logistics to shortages to security, Buy America Act. These things we advocate with our members for and for the industry. Our Quest Forum, or our business performance community, focused on again quality management. So we've maintained and managed TL 9000, the quality management system for the ICT industry, for over 20 years, and we are now launching our supply chain security standard, SCS 9001. And then finally, technology enablement programs. So these are programs that are helping drive the technologies that are being fueled by 5G. So a couple of examples are the data center community that we have, focusing on requirements and certification for data centers. And finally, why I'm here today, our Smart Buildings program. And you can go to the next slide, Matt, and I'll tell a little bit more about our Smart Buildings program. So a little over 2 years ago, we created a relationship or a partnership with UL to build a Smart Buildings program. So again, talking about what we do from a standards-based process. So what's unique about this program is it is built with that standard-based methodology, leveraging, as you can see, well over 60 members and participants who have come together to, really at the end of the day, define what is a smart building. How do you measure a smart building, right? All of the assessment criteria that's involved in that, and then working closely with UL to actually build a tool to measure the smartness of a building. So you can see, I'm happy to say all three of the panelist companies here have been involved with our Smart Buildings program in developing this criteria. This next slide, Matt, and I'll dive into, I guess, the main topic at hand. What is a smart building? So like Matt said, you can get many different definitions. There are programs out in the industry that have, identified or, I guess, judged buildings on certain sets of criteria, whether it's their power and energy consumption, or their sustainability, or their wellness. When we embarked on building out SPIRE, the goal was to build what we envision as really the first and most comprehensive objective smart building assessment tool. So you can see the screen here, 6 different assessment criteria come into, determining the smartness of a building. So everything from power and energy, health and well-being, life and property safety, sustainability, and cybersecurity. And I saved the best and, I believe the most important for last, it's connectivity. So all of those things that you see are really important in determining and evaluating how a building functions, right? But all of those things have to come together and be, coalesced into being able to be accessible to the stakeholders, right? So you can converged apps to track the lighting systems, HVAC systems, right? Air purification systems, which are becoming much more prevalent than they were just a few years ago. All right, protecting the assets in the building. That comes down to also cybersecurity, and of course sustainability. Our new generations of of tenants and also employees see, sustainability as a very important aspect. So something has to be, truly thought of in developing a smart building. But at the end of the day, like I say, everything is going to funnel through that connectivity. So the convergence of wired connectivity, different types of wireless connectivity, low power solutions to drive connectivity. So that's really, again, I think if you ask, it's a wide definition, but what is a smart building? A smart building has got to be, right? It's in the, and sometimes it's in the eye of the beholder, right? It's in the eye of the tenant, it's in the eye of the building manager, but they want to be able to access everything that they consider important about their building that's going to drive their ROI and make their tenants happier. And again, how are you going to access all of that really important information if you don't have a really strong connectivity backbone? So I think that's, like I say, we like to, to say that connectivity is at the heart of all smart buildings, but everything else are the, the important organs that are driving that ecosystem. You go to the next slide, Matt. I'm going to talk a little just to, so the SPIRE tool, again, that we built with UL, it has a two-step process to determine the building's intelligence. One is a self-assessment tool. This is actually a free tool. You can register for it online on UL's website and take your building through. Again, that's 6 different criteria. Multiple questions on these criteria. You typically have to pull in other, different stakeholders in the building, right? Your facilities manager, maybe somebody from cybersecurity, and so on and so forth, to answer all those questions, and then come to, get a rating or get a score, another rating, but a kind of a benchmark of where your building exists, right? Understand where you need to make investments. And ultimately, when you feel that you're ready, right, you do the verified assessment. That's actually a process of a UL verified auditor coming in and going through the building again and getting a verified mark at the end of the day. So again, I think just to what is a smart building? A smart building is it, like I say, it's all those components coming together. But at the end of the day, how is the connectivity is where I think is the most key component, which I think you guys are going to dive into a lot more today.
All right, thanks, Pat. Appreciate that. Yeah, that's a good segue for our panel. That it truly can be a lot of things, but ultimately we're connecting all these sensors and devices to enable whatever the goal is for that tenant, like you said. So thanks, appreciate that. So we're going to dive into our panel here in just a moment. I will add that you can click on the Q&A button and submit questions either now or as we progress through the panel. If you have questions for Pat about the Smart Building Program or SPIRE, feel free to submit those. Or if you have questions for our panelists as we grill them on some of these things, please submit them and we'll go through them at the end. So with that, let's get started with our panel. Again, we have Chris, Blaine, and Mari on the line. And as you can see, we're representing different parts of the industry, from manufacturing to integration to testing and certification. So I'll dive right into it here. So Chris, I'm going to ask you the obvious question just to get us started. We're talking about passive optical LAN and smart buildings. So the question for you is, can I use passive optical LAN to enable connectivity for my smart building?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And Pat, thank you for your perspective on smart buildings and some background on TIA SPIRE initiative. Yeah, I mean, at its core, passive optical LAN, or POL, is really just a fiber optic means to transport Ethernet and data services. So it can be used for a lot of different applications that require Ethernet connectivity. So yeah, the short answer is yes. I would add to that there are even some advantages to using fiber over traditional copper Ethernet. And it's a proven technology that's been deployed in a lot of different market verticals. And I'll just give one quick example, which is a warehouse. Right, in a warehouse, you're covering a very large area. You've got a number of different technologies that all require connectivity: Wi-Fi, private LTE, IoT, voice, video, data, some of the other aspects that Pat touched on. So yeah, POL is certainly a technology and network infrastructure that can be used for smart buildings, and maybe even the ideal choice for smart buildings and smart campuses.
Okay, great. Thank you. And it's funny because we say smart building, but that can really encompass more than just one building. It could be a campus or a lot of acreage that surrounds a building, right? Because those sensors could be anything on that property. And so, Mari, my question for you is that, in regards to that statement about, covering long distances, if I've got a sensor or a gate or something that needs connectivity, say 2 kilometers away, anything I need to know about using passive optical LAN in my smart building application there?
Yeah, Matt, not in terms of reach. The single mode fiber and transceivers that are used for passive optical LANs have a reach of typically something like 20 kilometers, and so 2 kilometers is not any kind of a problem. It's one of the great merits of fiber communication. Of course, they're not susceptible to electromagnetic radiation, of course, relatively lightweight compared to copper. So no, the reach is not a problem. The 2 kilometers is not a problem at all.
Okay, great. That's good to hear. Blaine, as an integrator, are you seeing, distance as a factor in any of your installations?
Yeah, we definitely have seen it in the past, particularly in campus deployments. So in those environments, it's not uncommon to have a legacy approach where the building automation for the campus, as well as the IT facilities themselves, IT infrastructure rather, are completely separate architected systems. They're operated separately. So you often have this stove type of approach to this IoT environment in campuses. So in most cases, when you're dealing with sensors that are very far away, you'll need to convert the protocol anyway. So just as we've done for decades, you put a protocol converter and you transport it over Ethernet if you have to do any long distance transmission. So most IoT protocols for simple sensors just don't have the reach on a pair of wire, or even when they're using wireless protocols like Zigbee or Wi-Fi, the reach isn't there. So the most direct approach is to encapsulate the sensor protocol with Ethernet and send it over a passive optical LAN. That's the easiest approach, and you have no distance limitations. You don't have a need to extend an Ethernet switch out in a distant location just so you can connect the device. With an optical network terminal and a POL, you just move that ONT closer to the device it serves. So it really reduces complexity and operational expenses.
Okay, very interesting and good insight for sure. As I think about that, and okay, so we've got this sensor, on the far reaches of the campus. That's just one little spot, though. In a smart building, I can imagine that we're gonna accumulate hundreds, or I don't know, maybe even thousands of these sensors and data collectors and cameras and everything else. That seems like that's going to turn into a lot of bandwidth potentially. Chris, to go back to you, passive optical LAN, lots of bandwidth. What can you do for me there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Matt. So, and not to get too far into the weeds on the PON technology, I'll just kind of touch on the fact that the most common technology that's used in an optical LAN is a standard called GPON, and that's really more than sufficient for most of these applications. But as you start to pile these devices onto a network, and even if the devices have very low bandwidth requirements, I can certainly see scenarios where you're going to exhaust the capabilities of the network. And in those cases, using a passive optical LAN network, you can do some engineering to support that increasing bandwidth need. And one example would be reducing the split ratio. Again, don't want to go too far into the weeds of the PON, what the PON network looks like. But basically, you're doing a fiber split, and typically you would do a 1:32 split in most enterprise deployments of PON. But cutting that in half, just as an example, would effectively double your bandwidth on the PON. And one of the other key benefits of a POL network is that once the fiber infrastructure is in place, meaning the fibers and the splitters, all the cabling infrastructure, you can use different wavelengths from different PON standards to deliver higher bandwidth. So another way to solve that problem potentially would be to introduce wavelengths on the existing network infrastructure that support higher speeds. And an example of that would be XGS-PON, which essentially is 4 times the bandwidth of GPON in the downstream direction. So if your building has a POL network that uses GPON, you can pretty simply add the XGS wavelengths and they can ride over that existing cabling infrastructure without any changes like you would need to do in a copper Ethernet environment. And so the result is that every port on the splitter would now have access to both of those technologies, and you're adding a tremendous amount of bandwidth to that existing network infrastructure.
I like it. So that conversation of going from Cat 5e to Cat 6 to 6a to 8 or whatever comes next, sounds like that doesn't really come into the equation at all. But Mari, for you, Chris is talking about moving to XGS-PON. Anything I need to think about as I do that?
Yeah, well, as Chris pointed out, the ITU and the IEEE have designed XGS-PON to be compatible in terms of its wavelength plan with GPON, and so you can overlay XGS-PON on a GPON network. The only consideration beyond that is you need to have some muxes. Sometimes they're referred to as coexistence elements to be able to strip away either the GPON or the XGS-PON to the ONT that you're trying to reach. So, I mean, the nice thing is that doing an overlay with XGS-PON is very cost effective. Yeah, there's some additional hardware costs, but those costs are relatively low.
Okay, I love it. The future usability of this sounds awesome. Going back to you, Chris, since you're talking about XGS-PON and this extra bandwidth, I'm guessing smart buildings are not the only place where you're seeing the need for additional bandwidth. Are you guys seeing demand in other verticals or applications?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would say, having an increased number of devices on the network can be a driver for some of these newer PON technologies, but we're seeing drivers in more traditional enterprise settings. And the driver in those cases could be applications where large file transfers are being used, like CAD, medical imaging, or even video production. So certainly applications outside of what Pat has defined here as a smart building.
Okay, all right, great. Thanks. Blaine, what about you? Are you seeing your customers moving to XGS-PON at all?
So certainly 10 gigs been around long enough now that there are certainly customers out there that are using it. It's not like it was a few years back where it was a considerable uplift in costs. The concern about 10 gig being too costly is no longer the case. But right now, for our integration team, we've got customers out there that have demo systems using 10 gig. So it'll probably be later this year, early 2023, before we have any significant deployments using 10 gig. And that's really more of a function of the long sales cycle associated with these large networks. So I think going forward, customers are going to see 10 gig as something they can easily add to their systems. It's not necessarily a choice they have to make now. You can add 10 gig where you need it, add the 10 gig ONTs down the road, or certainly it's cost effective to deploy 10 gig today. It's just really a choice. And I think as the market increases in the next few years, 10 gig is probably going to be a lot more prevalent.
Okay, interesting. It's interesting to hear how customers are leaning that way, but not necessarily doing it immediately. But I guess it's nice that they have the ability to do that on their schedule, not necessarily have to do it right away.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so let me call it an end to the panel for now. For our attendees, please submit your questions because we want to hear what questions you might have for our panelists. You can submit those with the Q&A button. I'm going to give you a chance to do that. And while you're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit more about the Association for Passive Optical LAN. So AppleLAN, as we call it, is dedicated specifically to the education and advocacy for passive optical LAN, that fiber to the X technology, specifically in the enterprise smart building environment, those types of things. It's probably a good time to mention that if you're going to be at the BIXI conference, we will certainly be there. We're actually offering training at the BIXI conference. So if this is something where you're seeing that your clients and customers are looking to put in this technology and you're not quite sure where to start, we can help you with that for sure. Our members include everything from manufacturers to integrators, distributors, test equipment, you name it, all walks of life in terms of the passive optical LAN life cycle. So we'd be glad for you to join us if you fit into one of those categories. All right, so in terms of questions, give me just a moment here and see what we have coming in. Pat, we have one question that came in that might actually be a good one for you to answer. So I'm gonna throw that out there. You can click the Q&A button to see what's coming. I'll give him a moment to think about that one. And then I'm going to throw out another question I see come in that would probably be a good one for Chris as a manufacturer, in terms of equipment. What types of equipment would be applicable for a smart building initiative? I'm thinking maybe he's talking about ONT models or something like that. Is that something you could answer?
Yeah, sure. And maybe I'll just kind of step back and talk a little bit about POL and why that, why POL is advantageous for some of these applications. I would say, first and foremost, we are reducing the network complexity by using a POL network. These devices and services that you're going to offer in a smart building, they typically have their own network. So collapsing these disparate networks onto a single fiber network really has some operational benefits. POL can also offer a very low upfront CapEx cost, as well as reduced total cost of ownership compared to a traditional Ethernet. So, aside from some of the technical benefits, there are also financial benefits. Some of these benefits could be very important for some applications. One of the operational benefits, for example, would be the fact that it's a greener solution, requires less power than traditional Ethernet. Maury already talked about the fact that fiber cabling can be lower weight, and also requires less cabling, fewer cables than a traditional copper Ethernet solution. And we touched on the fact that it also, the optical network spans very long distances, tens of kilometers from a central aggregation device. And so I guess to get to your question, Matt, from an ONT, so Blaine also touched on ONT, so optical network terminals. These are devices that effectively terminate the fiber and hand off the data connectivity to whatever device you're trying to connect in your building. So these ONTs, they come in a various number of form factors, and they can be specific for different applications or different port densities. And in terms of the densities, they range from, on the small end, an SFP form factor that you could directly place into a camera or a server that needs connectivity onto the PON network. They can also, on the high end, look very much like a rack mounted Ethernet switch. So, PON fiber connectivity and then Ethernet handoff to those devices. Matt,
okay.
Does that kind of hit on the
yeah, I think that answers it. But again, please feel free to submit questions, or if you have follow-ups, let us know. So we got lots of questions streaming in here now. So Pat, I'm going to pick on you next. It looks like a couple of these questions will actually be for you, but one question that came in is, what percentage of the building needs to be quote unquote smart to be called a smart building? Is that something you can answer?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer what in terms of percentage of it's. I think I would love maybe for Brian to, if he has a building that he manages, or even a client building, I don't know what Brian does, it could, take that free SPIRE self-assessment and maybe start to, that's the kind of benchmarking data that I think we need as part of the tool. I think it's just a hard question and answer to say what percentage of a building needs to be smart to be called smart. So
fair enough. Maybe so there isn't a hard and fast number, I think, is probably the simple answer.
Yeah.
I guess it might depend on how many not so smart devices you have in there also. It's all about PCs
Yeah,
and desktops
like I can,
everything.
yeah, exactly. And, and we even measure things like, for instance, how is the, coverage in things like stairwells and parking garages. So you can think of in terms of coverage, you probably want to near 100% coverage of your building to be smart. But there's so many other aspects. I think that's a tough one to answer. I'd love to maybe chat with Brian offline and even bring in our program manager from the Smart Buildings program to have a discussion.
Okay, perfect. Let's see, Blaine, I think I'll pick on you for this question from Greg. What is driving the move to XGS-PON? Is it strictly the price point, or is it applications like Wi-Fi 6, 6E with multi-gigabit Ethernet?
Yeah, so XGS-PON is definitely a great fit for customers who have concerns about bandwidth utilization. Oftentimes, customers do have the metrics to show that their nature of their business, they're vulnerable to having bottlenecks in the network. Particularly, as somebody mentioned earlier, that if you have an environment where you have CAD or you have medical imagery, that the bandwidth is enormous. But these latest iterations of these latest standards, I should say, for Wi-Fi really have taxed some IT shops with the need to really invest in expensive switching capabilities. So if you're going to extend two multi-gigabit interfaces to a wireless access point, and those are available on the market today, that's going to be really costly from a high density Wi-Fi environment. If you have a customer with hundreds of wireless access points, and you need to deploy a switch that can extend multi-gigabit to all of those devices, it's going to be really costly. XGS-PON allows you to actually deploy a 10 gig ONT, which has multi-gigabit interfaces on it already. So you're basically moving that that Ethernet port, that multi-gigabit Ethernet port, closer to the access point, lowering the amount of copper you need in your infrastructure, and at the same time, just the optics are way less expensive than what you'd see in a traditional enterprise switch.
Okay, very helpful. Thanks. Mari, a question for you. Special testing equipment that might be needed for passive optical LAN or a smart building application.
Yeah, well, conventionally, technicians who are installing or maintaining passive optical LANs might be given a power meter and a VFL, a visual fault locator. The power meter used to check the power at the ONT, and if power is low, then they could use the VFL to try to understand what's going on. Is it a bad connector? Is there a macro bend in the fiber? Is there even a break? Problem with that is that it really gives very little information for the technician to work with. So there is a new generation of affordable handheld optical fiber multimeter, so-called, that have things. They use reflectometry. They're not OTDRs, but they use reflectometry to determine the length of the fiber, the insertion loss, the optical return loss. They can then map any faults that are there, so fiber breaks or macro bends or bad connectors or anything, and give you a precise location for those. So it allows the technician to really be autonomous and address issues without having to invoke additional help from second line help from his organization. So it allows technicians to close problems much more effectively. It also includes a power meter and a light source at multi-wavelengths, and so they can verify power levels for both GPON and XGS-PON. So a really nice new sort of generation of tools, very affordable, and doesn't require the expertise level that typically the OTDRs require. So that's one thing to think about. And in fact, that's what we are recommending for the installation and maintenance of these sort of optical LANs.
Okay, very helpful. I always think of the OTDR as a very intimidating device. Just the name of it alone is intimidating, right? So it's good to know that there's simple tools out there for
absolutely.
troubleshooting.
Yeah, we understand that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, Let's see. I'm going to go back to you, Pat, because this is very specific to SPIRE. What exactly is the value to CRE or enterprise building owners and operators to become SPIRE certified?
Yeah, right. The holy grail. What's in it for me? What's the ROI? So I think with specifically to SPIRE, since the program is new and we're still, collecting benchmark data, right? There'll be a time when we can start to better define what that ROI is for a building owner or a manager. But I would say there's a couple things I think are easy to point out that are of value. So the fact that it's a two-step process and that the first step is free in terms of financial investment. Of course, there's the time investment in bringing together the right people from the organization to do an assessment on the building either you own or you manage, to understand where it stands in terms of again, that whole holistic criteria. So we've had some CREs go through the process, and one of the big outcomes they said was they truly learned so much about the building that they didn't know, right? They didn't know, one of the quotes was, "I didn't know a building could do all of this," So it's really getting the ability to truly understand by looking at that criteria that's been built by over 2 years by all these industry experts to understand where your building sits in terms of being able to meet the needs of, the evolving needs of tenants. And then, the value of the assessment criteria is going to depend on, on the value on a verified assessment. It is putting that mark on your building to be able to engage with tenants. We know it's going to be a very competitive time in commercial real estate, right? Whether as companies are determining, how they're going to go back to work, if they're going to go back to work, and what percentage they're going to go back to work. There may be some new paradigms as far as space sharing and again that intelligence of a building to attract tenants will depend a lot on, frankly, on how successful our SPIRE program is, and we're putting a lot of effort and investment into that program to be the judge for smart buildings of the future. So I think the first thing though is really getting to really understand where your building sits in terms of again that holistic criteria in terms of connectivity being at the heart of it.
I like it. That's a good answer. Especially like you're saying that I might learn something about my own building that I didn't know before.
Yeah,
that's great. Okay, this is a good question. Might be our last one here, and I'm gonna go to Chris and then Blaine on this one because I'd like to hear both perspectives. The question is from Curtis. Have you started to see applications of GPON in the primary and secondary high school environments? Is it cost effective to use in lieu of traditional copper? So Chris, I'll go to you first. Thoughts?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I think there is this misperception that PON in an enterprise environment like this has to be a very large network. When we talk about smart buildings, you immediately go to a big warehouse or a high-rise building that has hundreds, if not thousands, of Ethernet ports. But what we've seen is that it certainly does fit in smaller applications. Higher ed has been was an early adopter of PON use for optical LAN, and we've certainly seen that play out in K-12 deployments as well. So yeah, I think again, there's a big misperception out there that the networks are only for very large buildings and very large applications, but we've certainly seen applications K-12 and otherwise where you're talking about tens of Ethernet ports that are required on a network, and PON seems to do well in those spaces also.
Okay, great. Blaine, your perspective on GPON in the enterprise, not the enterprise, the education environments?
Yeah, so going back years now, we've seen lots of opportunities and successful deployments in K through 12 as well as higher education. So I think one of the earlier ones, 2010, I think it was, we deployed a network for a community college in Maryland. We're still supporting them today, and that system continues to expand. We have a university customer that has a POL network. We have several elementary K through 12 schools, particularly in Washington State. So it's definitely a great fit for them. As Chris said, it doesn't have to be a large elementary school or high school. It can be a fairly small school, and it still makes sense. You're talking double-digit savings on CapEx, and so school systems can definitely take advantage of that.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So it sounds like it's definitely a good fit for the K-12, whether that's primary or secondary. And so we have one other question, which is actually kind of a perfect closer, I think, for us, and I'll answer that one actually. The question is, how do you find the information necessary to design and implement a passive optical LAN? You're doing it here. Certainly this is a great start, but the Association for Passive Optical LAN, it's kind of a great segue to just talk to you a little bit more about the association. So if you go to our website, you can see our members. Like I said, if you look across our member base, it encompasses all of the solutions that you would need to design and implement passive optical LAN, from the design and engineering side to the manufacturers of the cabling and the electronics, to the resellers, to the tests equipment manufacturers. So if you consult with Appalan, or at least go to that membership base, you can find all the answers you have. As we go forward, what you're going to see on our website is the actual life cycle and who the members of Appalan are, and what they can do to help you in all those various stages of deployment. So with that, I will close out our webinar. Thank you everybody for attending. We periodically do these every few months, so keep an eye on your email for the next one. Maybe I'll see you at Bixie. I will be there, so I'd be glad to talk to anybody about that if you'd like. And please visit our website, appalaneglobal.org. With that, thanks everybody, and have a great day.